Good morning. My name is Ainsley Stinson, and I will be presenting my thesis on lost childhood, the unraveling of childhood innocence in an age of technology. Sleeping Beauty, written as early as 1330, is a popular fairy tale told to children for hundreds of years. While its original purpose may not initially appear as a warning against the loss of childhood innocence in American society, a clear parallel can be made. Once upon a time, in a magical land, there lived a king and queen. More than anything, the king and queen wanted a baby. And then finally, miraculously, the queen gave birth to a baby girl, who they named Aurora. Overcome with joy, the king and queen hosted a feast of celebration and invited 12 of the wisest women in the land to bestow gifts upon their daughter, gifts of virtue, beauty, and riches. However, as the story goes, the king and queen made a terrible mistake, and ultimately, a curse was placed on baby Aurora. Before she turned 16, Aurora would prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a deep slumber. The king and queen were horrified and did everything in their power to prevent this prophecy from coming true, but they were unsuccessful. On the eve of her 16th birthday, Aurora approached a spinning wheel and, just as prophesied, pricked her finger and fell into an immediate slumber. The king and queen were distraught. They had done their best to protect their daughter and had come so close to succeeding, but they were no match for the power of the spinning wheel. The effects of the dangers of the spinning wheel are similar to the effects of the dangers of technology, and it can be argued and proven that children everywhere are pricking their finger on the metaphorical spindle of a spinning wheel, which is the loss of childhood innocence. Instead of falling into a slumber, they live a life of eternal and perpetual childhood, unable to mature and grow into fully functioning adults because of the innocence that was taken from them too early. Parents, often aware of this danger, hope to protect their children, but end up leaving them to fend for themselves in a technological society that gives them access to the very things that take away what they can never again attain, their innocence. It is important to understand the difference between childhood innocence and perpetual childhood. One is delightful to the Lord, while the other demonstrates a lack of maturity and denial of adulthood. Childhood innocence is pure, thinks of goodness, and displays virtue. Perpetual childhood prevents healthy relationships with friends, family, and ultimately the Lord. In Matthew 18, 2-4, Jesus is teaching a crowd of people when he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." God values a childlike heart posture and position, even from adults. But in our world today, children hardly have this childlike faith that was once commended by Jesus himself. There is a glaring problem with American childhood. Children are not children anymore. Their innocence has been stolen and their childhood commodified. But what is to blame for this plight? Television and modern media. However, this problem is not new. Newton N. Minow, author of Abandoned in the Wasteland, Children, Television, and the First Amendment, gave a speech in 1961 warning parents of the dangers of television. Additionally, New York Times author Marie Wynn has written several articles since 1981 warning parents of the lost innocence in their children. But if this problem is not new, why is it only worsening? Normalization. We have become immune to and complacent with the inundation of technology in our lives. Parents no longer see an issue with handing their child a screen, like a cell phone, tablet, or TV, and letting them spend hours on it. Society promotes the idea that the more children know, and the earlier they know it, the better. Little kids are now little adults. Young girls no longer want to emulate their mothers, but instead their favorite celebrity or Instagram influencer, with Photoshop bodies and heavy filters. Instead of playing baseball or racing cars, little boys spend hours staring at a screen, mindlessly playing video games where they are exposed to violence, murder, and child predators. Yet, we stand idly by while the joy and innocence of childhood is being ripped away from the ones who need it most. Imagine two different worlds, two different societies and cultures, and two different 8-year-old children. It is a Friday morning. The first boy is awoken by his parents, where he eats breakfast at the table with his family, perhaps listens to the radio, and gets ready for school. At school, the boy learns from books and plays outside with his friends. They have simple and innocent conversations, play make-believe, and are ignorant of the dangers of the world outside of school. After school, the boy returns home, where he does his homework, plays with his toys, and reads a book. That night, his family eats dinner together and talks about their day and the weekend to come. The boy is blissfully happy and cannot imagine life any other way. Now let's shift to the second boy. His parents divorced when he was 6 years old, and his mom works 2 jobs to provide for him and pay the bills. The boy wakes up from an alarm clock, and by the time he is awake, his mom has left for work. The boy goes to the kitchen, pours himself a bowl of cereal, and then plants himself in front of the television until it is time for the bus to take him to school. The morning news is on. The boy watches as the news anchor reports on things like murder, gang violence, robberies, and the newest updates on abortion laws. At school, the boy stares at a screen while his teacher teaches through PowerPoints and YouTube videos. At recess, the boy and his friends talk about what they have been watching at home, topics and images that no 8-year-old boy should be discussing. They reenact drive-by shootings and kidnappings that they've seen in movies and on video games. After school, the boy returns home. His mom will not get off work until 10 or 11 p.m., so the boy sits down on the couch and watches more television. He watches sitcoms, reality TV, and R-rated movies because that is what is available to him. Then the boy grows tired and falls asleep, only to repeat the same routine again tomorrow. While this comparison may seem drastic, it is a common reality for many American children. Minnows abandoned in the wasteland, children, television, and the First Amendment states a frightening fact. Most American children spend more time watching television than they do with their parents. Children aged 6 to 12 watch an average of 20 to 28 hours of television a week, no matter their social setting or economic status. By the time most Americans are 18 years old, they will have spent 15,000 hours in front of a screen, about 4,000 more than they will have spent in school, and far more than they will have spent talking with their parents, friends, or teachers. American children entering the first grade will have already spent the equivalent of 3 school years in front of a television set. This immense amount of unrestricted time in front of a screen is causing an abundance of issues: physical, mental, and psychological. What a child sees on television is not what it used to be either. Shows and movies on TV were once safe for children and often family-oriented. There were no adult-only television programs, and watching television was seen as a pastime for the entire family. But as time and technology progressed and our society grew increasingly liberal with the information given to the general public, television became a dangerous place for children. The study Impact of Media Use on Children and Youth by the Pediatrics and Child Health Organization states that the average child sees 12,000 violent acts on television annually, and that there is a direct relationship between watching violent television programming and an increase in violent behavior in children. The television shows children are watching are violent, which is out of their control, but they are becoming desensitized to the acts they are seeing committed, and these acts are, in turn, normalized and replicated in playtimes and during recess. Children learn and process the world around them by acting out what they see. However, if these acts are done in normal adult society, once the children have grown and matured, committing a crime will seem less like a criminal act. Even in a country with guns in most homes, the way television violence is portrayed has made a norm out of the extreme, the improbable, and the sensational. But it has not always been this way. The idea of childhood, and childhood innocence itself, did not come about until well after the Middle Ages. Before that, there were no children's books, games, or toys. Children were completely incorporated into adult life by the age of 7 or 8. However, adult life was much more simplistic. There were no corporate jobs or long days at the office. Many adults' livelihoods were similar to children's arts and crafts, things like spinning, pottery, weaving, and basket making. Men would work in the fields farming, taking their children with them, because they were just as suited for the tasks as they were. Adult leisure time was also similar to children's. Games like tag were originally played by adults, and music and storytelling were key components of medieval culture. But, as Emmanuel Leroy says in his study of 14th century life, Monteleu, adults functioned on a much less complicated emotional level, and their instincts were much more childlike. Children and adults alike ate with their fingers, wiped their noses on their sleeves, and behaved, in general, in the way that a child would normally behave. The shift in the perception of childhood began with John Locke in the 17th century. His Enlightenment philosophies brought about the Age of Innocence, and writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau furthered his ideas that children are shaped by their environment and experience. This led to an immense interest in the physical and psychological well-being of children. Aspects of childhood that were once viewed in a negative light were now idealized, things like trust, dependence, and innocence. Children were taken out of the workplace and put into schools, a place where they were isolated from the adult world, and their childlike behaviors were encouraged and flourished. While these ideas were upheld in society for centuries, by the mid-1900s, they began to unravel. The 1960s were a time of extreme political and social upheaval. The Vietnam War, Watergate scandal, Equal Pay Act, and Civil Rights Movement brought drastic changes to the American lives and homes. Divorce rates rose rapidly and have continued to rise since. And the Equal Pay Act caused many women to leave their homes in favor of the workplace. Most importantly, by the 1960s, most American households owned a television. Because of the lack of parental supervision due to rising two-income households and uncontrolled television usage, children were able to gorge on the knowledge of the adult world. Drugs, political crisis, sex, and violence began to consume America's children. These childlike behaviors that took centuries to develop have become completely warped in a matter of decades, and the formerly closed door between childhood and adulthood has been pushed ajar, and sometimes removed entirely from its hinges. According to Marie Wynne, there is a clear parallel between our current society and the early medieval one. Children and adults once again do many of the same activities in their spare time. However, instead of adult activities mirroring children's like they did in medieval times, children's activities now mirror adults, and young and old are united in a single great leisure time activity, watching television. Why has this new parallel, this synchronization of childhood and adulthood emerged? Why do the lives of children so closely mirror the lives of adults, when the norm was once the complete opposite? In her article, The Loss of Childhood, Marie Wynne states that the age of protection has ended, an age of preparation has set in. This simply means that parents now believe that protecting their children from the often harsh realities of the world only harm them in the long run. Adults often tell children much more about their personal life, relationship issues, financial problems, and work stress because they might as well find out sooner or later that life can be complicated and unfair and infuriating. Other parents, feeling frightened and out of control in a rapidly changing world, deliberately hasten their children's fall from innocence in hopes that they exercise self-control, a virtue that is a struggle for even most adults. They expose their children to frightening knowledge of violence, crime, and drug usage, praying that it is an unspoken and unlearned lesson of what not to do. This leads to an even larger problem. Dr. Peter B. Neubauer, child psychoanalysis, says, "The children who are pushed into adult experience do not become precociously mature. On the contrary, they cling to childhood longer, perhaps all their lives." Making a child a psychological equal in the household makes the assumption that children have the same ability to learn and process knowledge and experience as adults do. Children are separate and individual beings with specific needs and desires much different from adults. Children who do not have the capabilities to understand and process in the same way that an adult does cannot be treated like a mature adult. When treated this way, children can slip into a state of infinite childhood, never maturing, as a response to the trauma that harmful information can bring. While this problem of a rapid loss of innocence cannot be ignored, many parents and adults in authority view it with an apathetic attitude, saying that what a child sees on technology is simply part of our world today, and that we must accept it and move on. We cannot censor everything our children see on television, and if we do, they will simply get the information from somewhere else, like school or their friends. Besides, our world today is full of violence and brokenness and sin. Isn't hiding these things from our children hindering their ability to fit into society on a larger scale? This cannot be further from the truth. We cannot take a passive stance on a problem as large as the future of our children and even our nation. Imagine in the 1770s, when America was still a British colony, if our founding fathers saw the injustice, inconsistencies, and major problems with the way they were being ruled, but remained silent and continued life under British rule. America itself would never have come into existence if there were not people who saw a problem and instead of doing nothing, acted and invoked change. The same can be said for our society today. If we accept the violence, the propaganda, and the countless amounts of harmful information being thrown into children's faces today as simply part of our world now and something we can do nothing about, then nothing will ever be done. We must stand up for what we know is right and protect children against the harm from which they cannot protect themselves. Proverbs 22:6 says to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The Bible clearly places the responsibility of raising, guiding, and teaching children on their parents. However, this responsibility should not be viewed as a burden or unwanted obligation. Scripture also tells us that children are a blessing from the Lord, a fruit of the womb, a reward. If children are a blessing and a reward, then raising them should be done with the utmost care and importance. However, many parents leave the job of raising their children to the world. They inadvertently rely on television, social media, and movies to raise their children, instead of taking on their biblical role as teacher and nurturer. This leaves children to raise themselves when they do not have the capabilities to do so. But what about preparation? Is protecting children from the dangers of the world going to leave them unable to socialize, make friends, fit in, and live a normal life? Television and social media do the job that most parents do not want to do. It teaches children about sensitive and uncomfortable information. However, when the job of education is left to technology, it has the ability to expose topics like homosexuality, sex, violence, kidnapping, and weapons in whatever light it chooses. It now holds the power over major and formative information. Giving a child a screen and telling them to learn and explore is like giving a child a gun and telling them to learn how it functions. There is an immense amount of problems that come from this. Suicide, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and self-image issues are all real problems which children younger and younger are becoming involved, all because of a lack of parental guidance, care, and supervision. Western society is arming children with powers that are new and unknown, as well as ever-changing. If adults do not know how to fully and safely navigate technology, why should this be expected of children? We must stand up for what we know is right and protect children against the harm from which they cannot protect themselves. William Golding, author of the widely studied novel Lord of the Flies, recognized the systematic deterioration of the loss of childhood innocence at his novel's publication in 1954. Golding, who was a school teacher before enlisting in the British Navy, saw firsthand the detrimental effects of what happens when children are left to their own devices, and the long-term effects of the absence of parental supervision. The story follows a group of British schoolboys stranded on an uninhabited island after a plane crash. Left to themselves, the boys attempt to form their own society, electing one boy leader and giving others designated jobs and tasks. However, as time goes on, power struggles arise, and the boys descend into savagery. Their once civilized behavior unravels, leading to violence, chaos, and ultimately death. The novel explores themes of a loss of innocence and human nature, while emphasizing the need for order and adult guidance. The boys try to maintain order and justice on their own, but without the presence of adults, their structures and disciplines unravel, leading to utter chaos. Through this narrative, Golding illustrates that children do not have the maturity or mental capacity to be independent and functioning members of adult society. Even the task of electing a leader becomes complicated and even violent when the children must do it alone. Developmentally, they were simply not ready. Left to themselves and in great number, they self-destruct, reverting to their natural and childlike instincts, which produce herd-like savagery devoid of parental instruction, proving that children are not adults and should not be given the responsibilities and independence that adults are given. America is arguably the most advanced country in the world, with freedoms and liberties found nowhere else. That being said, the well-being of American children is among the greatest failures of American public and private life in the past 30 years. As Newton Minow asks in his speech to Congress in 1961, do we want to be the kind of nation, the kind of people, who abandon their children to a state of subhuman exploitation, regarding them as customers, and recognizing them as citizens only when they arrive on the brink of constitutional protection? If our country and our children continue down this self-destructive path, childhood itself may never return to the state it once was. Children will become adults at an earlier and earlier age until the idea of childhood itself may be demolished forever. Our ignorance and detached view of what is truly happening must end, and we must begin the process of returning to a simpler, more innocent time, when children were truly children, not adults in smaller bodies. Thank you. I would now like to open the floor for questions.
I have one. I am curious, you mentioned this point about looking in your paper and also from what you said about when children are taken out of the workforce and put into schools, how that had maybe a detrimental effect. Could you say more about the role of, did formalized education play any additional role in terms of this process of making children less innocent than maybe you touched on in your speech just now?
Yes, so I talked about how in medieval times, children went to work with their parents. They often did the same activities they were doing and contributed to the family in that way. But with the Enlightenment and the Age of Innocence, they were taken out of the workplace and put into schools. This placing of children into schools, I think, was a beneficial thing. And it promoted innocence because instead of being incorporated into society on a larger scale, they were with other children and they were learning and playing and using their imaginations. And so I think that formal education did have a positive impact on children's innocence. We see now that there's more and more technology being incorporated into schools, and obviously there are always things that go wrong and there's always flaws in every system, but I think that overall the school system was a positive thing for childhood innocence and childhood in general.
Great job, Ainsley.
Thank you.
I guess I'm curious if you would, okay, so the Bible tells us that we're all by nature sinners. So I'm curious how you would describe childhood innocence, if that makes sense, just to kind of give us that background.
Yes, so in my partition I define childhood innocence as pure thinking of goodness and delightful to the Lord. We also see in the Bible that Jesus calls us to be like children, and I think what he means by that is calling us to have this pureness and this open and childlike approach to his teachings, but also to the world around us. And so I think childhood innocence is a simpler thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Because it seems like there's a lot of complexity around this issue. And Rousseau's, you mentioned Rousseau in your paper, and his view of innocence was get away from influence of family and church, and you'll be a perfect human being. You'll find yourself, and that's perfect, pure innocence. In Golding's book, Lord of the Flies, is kind of exposing how foolish and flawed that is. Because if you leave kids to their own devices, they're going to self-destruct. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, Lord of the Flies is really about how if we think children have innocence and trust them too much, we're going to be fooled. But I think you could do a good job of saying how television and technology have further corrupted the kind of corrupting influences we already, intuitions we already have. I guess my question is this, is that like, what are some ways that I guess you would advocate us to respond to this current moment? Because now that you have telephones, cell phones, it becomes even more complex because you mainly are focusing on TV and the influence of TV.
Yeah, so obviously technology is a major part of our society today, and there are huge benefits that come with it. And I'm not saying that it's unavoidable or that children shouldn't have any access to it, because doing that would prevent them from fitting in a larger scale, and having access and the ability to use technology is an important part of going to college, getting a job, functioning. But I think that there are guidelines and there are times that children should be allowed access to technology, and what they should have access to should be monitored and restricted, because the internet is a big place and there's tons of things on there that children shouldn't see and that they're not ready for. And so yeah, I think restricting it and setting boundaries on when you can have it and how long you can have it are important steps in this.
Thank you.
Do you have any other, one of my questions I wrote down was, kind of plays off of that. Do you have any additional recommendations that you would make regarding kids and technology? You just gave a few recommendations about that, but do you have any other recommendations that you would make based on what you've read?
Yeah, I think the biggest ones are like setting times and what you allow, but also promoting other activities. I mean, playing sports, using your imagination, just simply like playing, being outside. Those are great alternatives to handing your child a screen as forms of entertainment, and I think that they're less popular now, but they have greater benefits.
I was just wondering how you chose this topic.
I really am not sure how exactly I came upon this, but as last year we were like searching for our topics, I was interested in something to do with children. I had originally looked into like something possibly to do with like learning disabilities and technology and like their effect on it. But as I was researching, I came across the articles by Marie Wynn that I found. And once I read them, I was like, this is definitely what I want to write my thesis on. Yes?
Did you find anything when you were researching that showed that one gender or the other tended to lose innocence faster?
No, I didn't find any research on like specific gender, I guess, in the way that they lose innocence faster. It was just kind of a general thing. Yes.
So I have a follow-up question that kind of captures the thing I was trying to get at earlier. It seems like trusting innocence too much is part of what leads to the problem. Childhood innocence too much is part of the problem. I'm just curious how you would respond to that question.
As in, can you elaborate?
So we give our kids television access, phone access, because we think they're good human beings. They're going
Right.
to respond well to these things. Surely they won't be corrupted by this. And then all of a sudden they get to be 18 or older and they're, twisted. Could the trusting of childhood innocence become a problem, I guess, is part of the question.
Yes, and I think that it's less about trust and more about like you can't control what your child sees. And you're like, sometimes children can stumble upon things on technology that they have no intent of finding. And so I think that the problem is not like, oh, my child, like, they're like maliciously looking for bad things and like they're being corrupted because of what they're searching out, but it's just the possibilities of what they can come upon. And so I think that, yes, trusting just that like they won't be corrupted and like everything will be okay, like everyone does it, is a major problem, possibly the biggest in like this problem with technology.
Ainsley, did you come across anything in your research that talked about, because you were specific to an age of technology, times that were appropriate to start introducing those types of things? Or did any of your research go that way?
I didn't research that specifically, but in Newton Minnow's book that I read, he does talk about how I think it's under the age of 4 or 5, like children should have little to no screen time at all, and that it's actually harmful to brain development and like responses and learning, and that as like you get older and mature, like, it's okay to incorporate technology. And like I said, like, it isn't this all-encompassing evil. There are good things that come from it. And it talked about how, like, incorporating it in small amounts and what you incorporate can be beneficial and have good outcomes. But giving it just unlimited is very dangerous. If they're okay.
I have one more.
Yes.
Well, just looking at this, you said the Bible places responsibility of raising children and guiding children like on the parents. I just wonder if you would just speak to what role does the church have? I'm thinking of like single parents and broken families and things like that. Do you have any thoughts about what role the church plays in the forming of children in this as well?
Yeah, I think that the church is an important part of formation of a child, and the church does bring along a sense of community. And like you said, for single parent households, the church can be a big, like, helping tool in raising your children. And I think that the church should be leaned into more for that, because it is a good place to find it.
Thank you, Ainsley.
If there are no further questions, thank you.